This is my true story. I spent 40 years raising my son, teaching him right from wrong, teaching him the value of honesty, and building a life that he could one day inherit. I thought growing old meant being cared for, not being managed. But one afternoon he smiled and said, "Mom, move to the nursing home. We'll take care of the rest." Those words sounded gentle, but I heard the greed hiding underneath. I didn't argue. I just smiled and signed a few papers he never bothered to read. A week later, the bank called him, and everything changed. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. James always liked to sound caring when he wanted control. That was the tone he used when he brought up the idea of the nursing home. He called it a comfortable arrangement, a temporary stay, a place where I could have care and company while he managed everything else. The words were sugar-coated, but I could taste the intention behind them. He wanted the house, the accounts, the insurance, the entire system that I had built over 60 years of work and discipline. He had grown impatient with the slow inheritance that life offered and decided to fast-track it through manipulation. I had seen this kind of strategy before in business, in family disputes, in siblings fighting over land. People always start with polite persuasion before turning ruthless. I watched him move around the kitchen, confident and casual, explaining how it would all be easier for me. He believed age had softened my thinking. He believed my silence meant agreement. What he didn't realize was that I had already learned how people behave when money comes between them. His father had done it to his brother once, and I had spent years fixing that mess. Now it was my turn to stay quiet, observe, and plan. He told me to pack lightly because the home provides everything. That line almost made me laugh. He wanted the house cleared out so he could move faster. I started going through my papers, titles, tax returns, old bank books. I kept a small locked folder that contained every document he thought he would inherit. He had no idea that I had never changed the ownership status of several properties he assumed were already in his name. My lawyer, Mr. Douglas, had been with me for 30 years. He knew my habits and my caution. I called him that evening and told him what was happening. He asked if I wanted to make a change. I told him not yet. People like James need to believe they've won before the fall feels real. I wanted him to feel the comfort of control before taking it away. The next morning, he came with papers. He was cheerful, almost proud. He had already filled in every page with his own handwriting, labeling them as routine management forms. I didn't sign them immediately. I pretended to hesitate. That's how you make a liar confident. You act unsure so they push harder. He explained each form like he was doing me a favor. He talked about reducing my stress, handling my bills, managing my estate. It was impressive how much he rehearsed. I read every line while pretending to struggle with my glasses. It was exactly what I expected. A full power of attorney transfer giving him complete control of my accounts, assets, and financial decisions. If I signed it as is, I'd be legally powerless. But I had another version ready. My lawyer and I had mirrored his documents, same design, same layout, but with reversed authorization. In this version, every clause that gave him authority gave it to me instead, over his business, his accounts, and his holdings. When he handed me the pen, I took a deep breath and signed, on my version. He didn't read it. He only looked at my signature. He smiled, thinking the job was done. I smiled too, knowing it had just begun. I made sure to store his copy safely in my lawyer's office. He left with confidence, certain he had gained power over me. I sat down afterward, calm and steady, reviewing what had just happened. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt anymore. I was prepared. People often mistake quietness for weakness, but the truth is, silence can be the sharpest strategy. The day I moved into the nursing home, he was cheerful, hugging the nurses, thanking the staff, pretending to be a devoted son. I watched him leave and wave from his car window, proud of what he thought he'd accomplished. I sat in my new room, neatly arranged with my things, and opened my phone to email Mr. Douglas. The message was simple. It's done. Execute the switch. He replied within the hour, confirming the final registration. From that moment, every account tied to his business now had my name listed as the controlling signature. I leaned back and closed my eyes. He wanted me comfortable and quiet, and that's exactly what I was. Comfortable, quiet, and in complete control. The paperwork came in a thick blue folder with tabs neatly labeled, a show of professionalism that made James feel proud of himself. He had gone through the trouble of organizing everything, or so he thought. Each form had small sticky notes pointing to where he wanted me to sign. He believed I would just skim through, trusting him like I always had. But trust without verification is how people lose everything. I spent the previous night studying every possible document structure he might use: estate transfers, investment consents, financial authorizations, and property management forms. I knew what to expect. What he didn't realize was that I still had all my faculties sharp, sharper than he ever imagined. My eyesight was weaker, not my judgment. The papers he brought were exactly what I predicted: a financial transfer authorization giving him power over every asset in my name. It was written in simple legal English, clear enough to fool someone who didn't think to read slowly. It allowed him to move money, liquidate property, close accounts, and even make financial decisions on my behalf. Essentially, it was a quiet theft wearing polite language. I kept my expression flat as he handed it to me, acting like I didn't understand half of what I was reading. He mistook that for compliance. When he left the room for a few minutes to take a phone call, I removed the top sheets and replaced them with the identical copies prepared by my lawyer. Every page looked the same except the main clause. Instead of granting James authority, it transferred his own business interests, savings, and assets under my temporary trusteeship. The date, the formatting, the header, everything was an exact match. The real difference sat in 2 lines buried inside the text. He would never notice because he never truly read what he signed himself. The irony was almost poetic, though I didn't see it as revenge yet. It was correction. I was teaching him a lesson in paperwork, the same lesson I had tried to teach him years ago when he ignored every word of advice about responsibility. He came back smiling, thanking me for being reasonable. I let him believe that. He opened his pen, placed it in my hand, and said something about doing the right thing for both of us. I signed with slow, deliberate strokes, my signature steady and clear. He didn't notice that the top corner logo was slightly different, the mark of my lawyer's firm instead of his. I watched him gather the folder, satisfied, thinking his plan had worked perfectly. He didn't even glance through the pages once they had my name on them. I let him walk out with his false confidence intact. After he left, I made a call to my attorney, confirming that the replacement documents had been logged and notarized. Within hours, my lawyer filed the changes at the county registrar and notified the bank to update account ownerships. Every asset of mine stayed untouched, while his were quietly redirected under my authority. It wasn't illegal. It was strategic literacy. I hadn't deceived him. He had deceived himself by assuming my age made me ignorant. He played a game with rules he didn't understand, and I just happened to know them better. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, looking at the remaining paperwork. The transfer meant his company accounts, vehicles, and even certain investments were now accessible to me as guardian trustee. It was almost amusing that the same legal clause he intended to use against me now belonged entirely to my side. He had dug his own pit and handed me the shovel to finish it. I placed every document neatly in a folder labeled contingency and sealed it with a red tab. My lawyer had a copy, the bank had confirmation, and the notary had verification. Nothing could be undone without my written consent. The next morning, James called to say he had dropped off the final forms at his office and that everything was in place. He said he'd handle the rest, that I could relax. I said nothing. Let him think he controlled the board. He didn't know the game had already ended. When I hung up, I made tea and looked around the house that he thought was already his. Every picture, every wall, every piece of furniture had a story tied to my name. I built that life, and now I had secured it. He wanted to teach me dependence. I had just given him a masterclass in consequence. The switch happened quietly, without any confrontation or warning. James thought everything was already in his control, but what he didn't know was that one small detail had changed everything. My lawyer, Mr. Douglas, and I had spent hours preparing an identical set of documents to the ones my son created. The paper looked the same, the header was the same, and even the signature spots matched. The only difference was in one sentence buried in the second paragraph. That sentence shifted power, turning the financial authority he wanted for himself into my legal control over his assets. It was the cleanest reversal possible, done without lies or drama. He had brought me documents he didn't understand, and I had replaced them with ones he never checked. I didn't do it out of anger. I did it because he needed to learn that intelligence doesn't age and respect doesn't come from inheritance. My attorney notarized every sheet and filed them under the correct timestamp. When the copies went to the bank, they became the new master documents on record. From that moment, everything he thought he owned was legally in my hands. I didn't boast about it or tell anyone. I just kept quiet and continued my normal routine. When James came over that evening to collect his copies, he had no idea the originals had already been certified in my favor. He thanked me, looking proud, confident, and completely unaware that he'd just signed away control of his life's work. He said he'd take care of everything now and that I could rest. I smiled, not because I was happy, but because I finally understood the power of letting someone underestimate you. He thought I was weak, that old age made me soft and slow. What he didn't know was that the same quiet patience that raised him was now teaching him his hardest lesson. The next few days went by peacefully. I moved into the nursing home as planned, keeping my calm and acting like nothing had changed. The staff there were kind, polite, and professional. I spent time reading, watching television, and talking with other residents. I kept my phone beside me and waited for the first sign that the papers had gone into effect. My lawyer emailed me updates confirming that the transfer had been processed at both the bank and the corporate registry. His name had been moved from the ownership list of his company. My name now sat in the first position. I was technically his superior in every financial sense. The irony was satisfying, but I didn't rush to use it. I wanted the moment to arrive naturally, the moment he realized what had happened. By the fourth day, his office accountant noticed discrepancies in their access rights. Certain accounts showed restricted authorization, and the automatic transfers he had set up to his personal card were blocked. The staff called him, thinking it was a technical issue. He dismissed it, assuming it was just a glitch. He didn't realize that those glitches were the start of a complete reversal of power. By the time he finally paid attention, it was already too late. Every account, asset, and record had been legally moved. There was no fraud, no deception, no forgery, just his own signature on the wrong set of forms. I kept everything perfectly documented. The lawyer's letter, the bank confirmation, and the official copies with seals. If he tried to argue, all I had to do was present the documents, and his own handwriting would be his downfall. For years, I had watched him chase control over money, decisions, and appearances. Now all that control existed only on paper, and that paper was mine. It was strange, sitting in a small nursing home room with more power than the man who once told me I should let go of responsibility. I looked out the window that night, feeling calm, not triumphant. What he had tried to take through arrogance, I had reclaimed through patience. The switch wasn't revenge, it was justice disguised as paperwork. The day I moved into the nursing home, everything went exactly as he planned. At least that's what he thought. James arrived early that morning with his wife, both of them looking proud, as if they had accomplished something noble. They carried a few of my bags, spoke softly to the staff, and made sure everyone there knew that they were the responsible family. I sat in my wheelchair, quiet, observing every detail. The way he smiled when signing the admission papers told me that he believed this was a final transfer of power. He didn't realize that the real transfer had already taken place a week earlier. The director of the nursing home greeted me warmly, showing me the room that had been prepared, small, tidy, and peaceful. My son stayed for a few minutes, giving instructions that no one asked for. He told the nurse to call him for any issue, told the staff about my medicine schedule, and even corrected them on how I liked my tea. It was almost amusing to watch him perform. People who think they've gained power always start behaving like they're managing a company, not a person. He left after an hour, saying he had to return to work. I waved from the window, smiling as his car pulled away. The nursing home itself was better than I expected. The staff were kind, the residents friendly, and the routine simple. There were scheduled meals, evening activities, and even a small garden where I could sit in the sun. I spent most of my first day reading and making polite conversation with the nurses. They were surprised by how calm I was. Most new arrivals cry or feel angry. I didn't. I had made peace with my surroundings long before coming. The quiet helped me think clearly. I thought about all the years I'd spent raising a man who now saw me as a burden. I remembered the late nights spent helping him with his studies, the times I had gone without new clothes so he could have better ones, and the countless sacrifices that had built his comfort. None of it made me sad anymore. It only confirmed that love without gratitude becomes weakness. That night, I spoke to my lawyer on the phone. He confirmed that everything had gone through at the bank, the registry, and even the tax office. James was now legally dependent on me, even if he didn't know it yet. I thanked him quietly and hung up. I didn't need to plan anything further. The system was already set in motion. All I had to do was wait. Over the next few days, I settled into the rhythm of the home. I joined morning walks, helped another resident with her crossword puzzles, and occasionally watched the news in the common room. The nurses liked me because I never complained. They said I reminded them of someone who had worked there before, patient, composed, and sharp. I smiled every time they said that. I didn't tell them the truth, that my calmness came from knowing I was in control of my life again. By the 5th day, I began to notice that something was shifting outside my little world. I received a message from my attorney saying that several of my son's business associates had contacted him to verify new ownership records. The documents showed my name instead of his. Some of them congratulated him, assuming it was a planned succession. Others were confused. But confusion always leads to questions, and questions lead to discovery. I spent that evening by the window, sipping tea, listening to the sound of rain against the glass. The home was quiet, peaceful, and clean. Everything my own house had stopped being after he took over. I didn't miss my bed or my furniture. I didn't miss my old life. I had left behind a house filled with arrogance and taken with me something far more valuable: authority. The move wasn't exile. It was strategy. I hadn't been sent away. I had simply relocated the battlefield. The call came exactly 7 days later, just as I expected. James must have been sitting in his office when the bank called because the first thing my lawyer told me afterward was how shocked he sounded. The manager wanted to verify recent changes in ownership records. Every account, business asset, and property under his name now had my signature listed as the controlling authority. The bank was simply doing its job, confirming that the transition was legitimate. James must have felt confusion first, then disbelief, and finally panic. He had no idea what was happening because in his mind, he had taken control of my finances a week earlier. What he didn't realize was that I had signed papers that made me the new owner of everything he had worked for. The bank manager's tone was formal, calm, and precise. When asked to confirm, the manager said, "Mrs. Eleanor Simmons is the authorized trustee on these accounts. All further access requires her written approval." My son tried to argue, but there's no arguing with documentation. He had never read the papers he pushed under my pen. His voice reportedly got louder with every question, but rules are rules. Without my consent, nothing could move. The same hour, my lawyer received an official call from one of his company partners, asking for clarification about the registration update. Mr. Douglas confirmed that everything was legally processed and notarized. He even emailed the documents to them for verification. The partners understood immediately what had happened. They had seen cases like this before: careless signatures, misplaced confidence, and poor oversight. I could imagine their faces while explaining to James that there was nothing they could do. The documents were airtight, filed properly, and beyond reversal without my written release. He had no leverage. His entire business, his vehicles, his assets, everything tied to his name, was now under my ownership. Not stolen, not forged, simply transferred, legally and cleanly. He had done it to himself. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my nursing home room, drinking tea, when I got the update. The staff had just finished serving lunch. The sun was warm through the window, and I could hear laughter from the hallway. It felt almost peaceful. I wasn't angry or vengeful. I felt calm, the kind of calm that comes when justice is quiet, not loud. I didn't celebrate. I just folded the printed confirmation, placed it in my drawer, and smiled. All those years of managing finances, handling paperwork, and reading every fine print had paid off. Age hadn't made me weaker. It had made me patient enough to wait for people to reveal who they truly were. The next morning, James must have realized how serious it was. The calls multiplied. First, the business line, then the personal one, then my lawyer's office. When he couldn't get through, he went directly to the bank. The manager said later that he arrived furious, demanding immediate access to the accounts. But policy doesn't bend for emotion. Without my written authorization, every transaction was frozen. Even his credit cards, which were tied to his company account, were locked for security. When the manager explained that he would need to speak with the new trustee, me, the silence that followed must have been unbearable for him. By evening, I received a call from Mr. Douglas confirming everything was settled. He said James had tried to call the bank's regional director, but was told the same thing. Only the listed trustee could request a reversal. I thanked him, hung up, and went for a quiet walk in the garden. The sunset was soft that evening, golden and calm. I sat on a bench and thought about how quickly greed can erase gratitude. My son had turned me into paperwork, and I had used paperwork to turn his lesson into permanence. That night, as I lay in bed, I imagined the scene at his house, the shouting, the confusion, the phone calls, and the panic. Maybe his wife was pacing, maybe his business partner was yelling, maybe he was just staring at the documents, trying to understand how everything slipped away. The truth was simple. He thought I was too old to protect myself. He forgot who taught him how to hold a pen. James came storming into the nursing home 2 hours after the bank meeting, red-faced, sweating, and shaking with anger. The staff tried to calm him, but he pushed past them, demanding to know where I was. He looked nothing like the confident man who had dropped me off a week earlier. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. The same residents who had smiled at him politely when he arrived the first time now turned their heads, watching his performance with quiet interest. I was sitting by the window folding laundry, pretending not to notice. When he finally reached me, he slammed the folder onto the table so hard that the nurse flinched. He started asking what I had done, his words stumbling over each other, his voice breaking between disbelief and fury. I didn't respond immediately. I just looked at the folder. It was the same one he had brought for me to sign, now bent and wrinkled from being handled too roughly. He pointed at the papers and said I had ruined everything, that the bank had frozen his accounts, that his business partners were panicking. He said the company couldn't even pay its employees because the funds were locked. Every time he raised his voice, the veins in his neck stood out. I didn't interrupt him once. When he finally stopped to breathe, I stood up and opened the folder. The papers were still there, all signed, stamped, and dated. My signature was on every page, exactly where he had told me to put it. The problem was that the forms weren't what he thought they were. They were the mirrored copies my lawyer had created, the ones that gave me legal control over everything he owned. He looked down, scanned the first few lines, and his eyes widened when he reached the header. The document title didn't read Financial Assistance Authorization. It read Business Asset Transfer Agreement. He kept flipping the pages, as if they might suddenly change back to what he remembered. They didn't. I could see his confidence collapse in slow motion. The color drained from his face. He had finally realized that he had been too arrogant to read what he had signed himself. He kept muttering that it wasn't fair, that I had tricked him, but nothing about it was unfair. I didn't lie to him. I didn't forge anything. I just signed what he handed me, or at least that's what he thought. The law didn't care about emotions. It cared about ink. The papers were legitimate, filed, and notarized. His signature sat right next to mine on every page. He was trapped by his own carelessness. The irony didn't make me happy, but it did bring peace. The same hands that once wrote "for your safety" on a folder had now written his own downfall. He sank into the chair across from me, holding his head in his hands. For a long time, he didn't speak. The staff pretended to stay busy, but I could feel their eyes on us. They had all heard enough to understand the situation. One of the nurses quietly closed the door to give us privacy. I folded the last of my clothes and placed them neatly in the drawer. James looked up, defeated, with tears forming in his eyes. He wasn't crying from sadness. It was the sting of humiliation, the kind that hits hardest when pride meets reality. I had nothing left to say to him. Words wouldn't teach him anything now. The lesson was already written in every document he had forced into my hands. He stood up suddenly, grabbed the folder, and left without another word. I watched through the window as he stormed out of the building, his steps uneven and his shoulders shaking. The staff avoided his eyes as he passed, but they knew the truth. By the time he reached his car, he was shouting into his phone, probably calling the bank or his lawyer, trying to undo what couldn't be undone. I sat back down, calm as ever. The storm had finally hit him. All it took was a pen, a few pages, and the arrogance of a man who thought his mother was too old to read. After he left the nursing home that day, the silence he left behind was almost heavier than the noise he had brought. The nurses whispered in the hallway. The residents looked at me differently, and even the director gave me a nod that said she understood what had just happened. I wasn't embarrassed. I wasn't shaken. I felt a strange stillness, the kind that comes when justice has already spoken. For days I had watched my son grow into someone I no longer recognized, impatient, entitled, and careless with the person who gave him everything. He had believed that control over my money meant control over my life. He had learned the hard way that control without knowledge is a curse. That night, I sat in my small room and thought about the way he looked when he realized what had happened. The color draining from his face wasn't just fear, it was recognition. For the first time, he understood that he had underestimated me. He thought I was the old woman who needed help signing documents. He forgot I was the same woman who built a family business, paid off a mortgage, handled his father's estate, and raised him through every financial storm we faced. The next day, I received updates from my lawyer and the bank. Everything had been finalized. The reversal of authority was complete, and my ownership over his company and accounts was secure. There was nothing he could do without my written consent. His name was still listed, but under mine, as a dependent trustee. It was poetic, but not in a beautiful way, more in the way that life balances its own scales. He had called the bank repeatedly, trying to prove some kind of fraud, but every time he tried to challenge the paperwork, he was reminded that his own signature was the evidence against him. My lawyer said that he eventually stopped arguing and simply went quiet. The bank manager even called me directly to confirm that I was satisfied with how things were resolved. I told him I was. That was the end of it. The following week, James came back to visit. This time, he didn't shout. He didn't bring his wife. He came alone, wearing the same expensive jacket he used to wear when he thought success made him untouchable. But he looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in spirit. He walked in slow, kept his eyes low, and spoke quietly. There was no anger left in him, just exhaustion. The staff gave us privacy again. He sat in the same chair he had stormed into days before, and for the first time in years, he listened. I told him that everything he tried to take was built with the same hands he betrayed. I reminded him that trust isn't automatic, that it has to be earned even between parent and child. He didn't interrupt me this time. He didn't argue. He just nodded. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long while, then stood up and left without saying a word. That evening, I thought about what had just happened. The satisfaction wasn't in winning or proving him wrong. It was in knowing he finally understood the value of what he had lost. Not the money, not the company, not the control. He had lost my trust, and that was something he couldn't buy back. The same arrogance that had driven him to steal from me had now humbled him to silence. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt peace. I had done what I needed to do, not for revenge, but for clarity. I needed him to see the difference between love and possession, between helping someone and using them. That night I sat by my window as the sun went down, watching the lights turn on across the courtyard. The sky was quiet, painted in faint orange and gray, the kind of calm that makes you realize you've done enough. He would have to rebuild his life now, not with my money or my name, but with his own mistakes as foundation. I wasn't worried about him anymore. He had learned what it felt like to lose everything because of his own choices. That kind of lesson stays forever. The week after the confrontation felt strangely peaceful. The chaos had shifted entirely to James's side of life, while mine became calm again. The bank called twice to confirm everything was stable. My lawyer sent final copies of the filings, and I began settling into my daily routine at the nursing home like nothing had ever happened. For me, it was closure. For him, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Within days, word spread among his business partners. The shock on their faces must have matched his. His authority had vanished from the company's systems, and my name appeared as the sole signatory on every major account. Meetings were canceled, deals postponed, and confidence in him crumbled. One of his partners called my lawyer to verify the documents, thinking there must be some misunderstanding. There wasn't. The lawyer confirmed everything was legitimate, notarized, and filed correctly. I had not broken a single law. The signatures, timestamps, and witness logs were all valid. My son had done this to himself. The partners quickly realized they had to work with me now if they wanted access to the company funds. I didn't act cruelly. I didn't shut anything down. I simply instructed that all future financial decisions go through proper approval. Mine. James called me every day for the first few days. I didn't answer. I had nothing left to say. Each voicemail grew shorter, his voice weaker. He started with anger, moved to guilt, then finally sounded tired. He said things like, "We can fix this," and "I didn't mean for it to go this far." But meaning didn't matter anymore. Actions had already written the ending. After a week of silence from me, he stopped calling. I heard later from my lawyer that he tried to reverse the transaction through another attorney. It didn't work. Every attempt bounced back with the same answer. Authorization required from Mrs. Eleanor Simmons. My authorization, my signature, my control. I was polite but firm in every response through legal channels. I instructed my lawyer to allow his company to keep functioning under temporary management, but only with transparent records. I didn't want to destroy what I had helped him build. I just wanted him to understand that everything he had was because of me, not despite me. Meanwhile, life at the nursing home went on. I became known among the residents as the woman who handled business like a boss, though I never bragged about it. The staff treated me with quiet respect. Even the director joked once that I should be running the place. I smiled, but deep down I knew I didn't need any more control. I had already taken back everything that mattered. What I wanted now was peace, not power. I spent mornings reading newspapers in the garden, afternoons helping other residents write letters, and evenings watching the sunset through my window. Every so often, I'd get an update from my lawyer about new filings or minor issues James caused trying to regain access. I never felt anger, only pity. He was fighting paperwork, but the real battle was with himself. A month later, I received a short handwritten note from him. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. It was an acknowledgement. He said he understood now why I had done what I did. He said he didn't blame me anymore. He didn't ask for anything, just wrote that he hoped I was comfortable and that he was trying to rebuild. I read the letter twice and then folded it neatly into my drawer. That was enough for me. The man who once shouted, schemed, and demanded control had learned humility through his own collapse. The following week, my lawyer told me James had agreed to dissolve his direct involvement in the company. I transferred partial authority back to the management board, but not to him. It was the cleanest ending possible. I had taught him responsibility without saying a word. From the quiet of my small room, I had watched him learn the lesson life had tried to teach him for years. That trust cannot be signed away, and power doesn't come from paper, it comes from integrity. I had no regret, only relief. The aftermath was not destruction, it was balance restored. After everything ended, there was silence. Not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels finished. The phone stopped ringing, the messages stopped coming, and the house that once echoed with arguments now stayed quiet. James no longer tried to fight. He didn't visit for weeks, and when he finally did, he looked like a man who had aged years and days. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that almost looked like humility. He brought flowers, the kind I used to like, but I didn't comment. We sat in the small visiting room of the nursing home, the same place where he once stood shouting. He spoke softly, avoiding my eyes, apologizing without really using the word sorry. He said he had made mistakes, that he only wanted to help, that things had gotten out of hand. I listened, not out of anger or pity, but because he needed to say it. His voice cracked when he talked about how everything had fallen apart. His business, his savings, his confidence. He said he was trying to rebuild. I nodded, but I didn't offer comfort. I had given him comfort all his life. What he needed now was consequence. When he left, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He just said he'd visit again soon, though we both knew it would take him time. The next morning, I found an envelope at the front desk. It was from him. Inside was a check. Repayment, maybe, or guilt, or both. I didn't cash it. I gave it back to my lawyer to shred. Money wasn't what he owed me. Respect was, and that can't be paid in dollars. My peace didn't come from watching him suffer. It came from knowing he finally saw me as more than a fragile old woman who needed to be managed. I had become a mirror to his greed, and he couldn't escape his reflection. The staff at the nursing home noticed the difference in me. I smiled more, joined group walks, helped the younger nurses organize the medication charts. They called me Miss Eleanor the teacher because I was always explaining how to check files and read contracts. I laughed when they said that. Maybe teaching was what I had always done, even when I didn't mean to. I had taught my son everything he knew about life, except the one lesson he had to learn the hard way. Never take advantage of the hands that raised you. The quiet days became my favorite. I would sit by the window in the evenings, watching the sunlight fade across the garden. Sometimes I'd see families visit the other residents, children bringing flowers, grandchildren bringing drawings. I didn't envy them. I had already had my family, and I had learned what kind of love lasts. Real love doesn't need control. Real family doesn't take your voice away. I had regained mine, not by shouting, but by signing one piece of paper at the right time. Every week I still received updates from the bank and my lawyer. Everything stayed steady, my accounts, my home, my savings, all back under my name, untouched and secure. I didn't gloat or feel victorious. I just felt safe. The balance of life had returned to what it should have been. I could rest knowing no one would ever call me helpless again. Months later, I got another letter from James. This one was different. It didn't talk about money or mistakes. It simply said he hoped I was happy and that he was doing better. He had found a small apartment, started consulting again, and was learning to live within his means. He ended the letter with one line that stayed with me. I finally understand what you were teaching me. That was all I needed. That night, as I turned off the lamp and looked out at the moonlit garden, I felt peace. I had been betrayed, underestimated, and discarded, but I had survived with dignity. I didn't destroy him. I disciplined him. Life had come full circle. He once managed my home, and now I managed my peace. Silence wasn't loneliness anymore. It was victory dressed in calm. James once told me he would take care of the rest, that I could stop worrying about everything because he would handle it. Those words used to bring me comfort. Now, when I think of them, I smile for a different reason. He meant control. I heard peace. What he didn't understand was that the two don't belong together. Control feeds greed. Peace grows from wisdom. When he tried to take my life apart through signatures and silence, I didn't fight him with anger or argument. I fought him with the one thing he never thought I still had: clarity. One signature, one quiet decision, and his entire plan turned back on him. The same papers that he prepared to take everything from me became the tool that gave me everything back. Life has a way of showing people their own reflection when they refuse to look in the mirror. James saw his, and it broke him for a while, but maybe breaking was the only way for him to understand the weight of his choices. I don't live in bitterness anymore. The anger I once felt has long faded. The nursing home became a place of quiet pride instead of shame. The staff call me a success story, but I don't see it that way. I see it as proof that age doesn't erase intelligence, and kindness doesn't mean weakness. I still get letters from him every few months, sometimes with updates about work, sometimes just a photo of him and his daughter, my granddaughter, who's growing fast. He signs every letter with "Love you, Mom," a phrase that used to sound routine but now feels earned. I always write back, but I keep my replies short. He needs to keep learning, and distance teaches better than comfort. Some nights when the halls are quiet and the lights are dim, I think back to that moment in the bank when everything changed. The sound of my phone buzzing, the calm in my lawyer's voice, and the image of my son realizing he had been beaten at his own game, not out of revenge, but out of reason. That memory doesn't bring satisfaction. It brings peace. Because I didn't ruin his life, I corrected it. The world doesn't often give older people the chance to defend themselves with dignity. We're told to sit quietly, to trust others, to surrender. But surrender isn't grace when it's forced. Grace is when you choose to act with strength and silence, knowing that the truth will eventually speak for itself. James finally learned that lesson. I didn't need to yell, argue, or demand apologies. I just needed to remind him, through action, that everything he had came from the same hands he tried to manipulate. The house he grew up in, the education that gave him his career, the values that built his ambition, all of it came from me. He forgot for a moment, but life has a way of reminding people where their roots lie. The day he saw his company name undermined must have been the hardest lesson of his life, but it was one he would never forget. Now, every morning when I wake up, I make myself a cup of coffee and sit by the window, watching the sun rise over the garden. I think about how calm life has become. No more bank calls, no more legal papers, no more shouting, just peace. Sometimes the nurses stop by to talk, and they always ask me how I stayed so calm through everything. I tell them it's simple. You don't fight people, you teach them. You don't destroy what you built, you reclaim it. My son once said, "Mom, move to the nursing home. We'll take care of the rest." And that's exactly what happened, just not the way he expected. He lost control, and I found freedom. He learned that the person he thought was old and powerless was still the same woman who built his foundation brick by brick. The bank called him that week. He screamed. I smiled. Some lessons aren't loud. Some just end in silence, the kind that says it's finally over and justice has already spoken.